Chapters 8 and 9, What About Us and Evolution Redux.
In The Descent of Man, Darwin speculated that our species had originated in Africa. In 1924, Raymond Dart, a professor of anatomy at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, discovered the missing link. What Dart found was a specimen he later named Australopithecus africanus. In 1871, the human fossil record was comprised of only a few bones of late-appearing Neanderthals. Dart's 1924 discovery of the Tungus child set off a hunt for human ancestors in Africa, which led to excavations of the Leakeys at Olduvai Gorge in 1930 and the discovery of Lucy by Donald Johanson in 1974. In 2002, Michael Burnett and his colleagues discovered an older possible hominin, Sahelanthropus judensis, from the Central African deserts of Chad. Like apes, it had a long cranium with a small chimp-sized brain, but like later hominins, it had a flat face, small teeth, and brow ridges. In Sahelanthropus, the hole for the spinal cord is farther forward than knuckle-walking apes, which hints it had the ability to walk upright. An early set of fossils from Kenya grouped together and known as Australopithecus anamensis, which shows hints of bipedality from a single fossilized leg bone. In 1974, Donald Johanson, an American paleoanthropologist, discovered the hominid bones of a single individual, later named Lucy, in the Afar region of Ethiopia. When Lucy's fragments were assembled, she turned out to be a female of a new species, Australopithecus afarensis, dating back 3.2 million years. It was determined that Lucy was between 20 and 30 years old, 3.5 feet tall, weighing about 60 pounds, and most important, she walked on 2 legs. Lucy's bipedality was determined by the way the femur connects to the pelvis at one end and to the knee at its other. In bipedally walking primates like ourselves, the femurs angle in towards each other from the hips so that the center of gravity stays in one place while walking. In knuckle-walking apes, the femurs are slightly splayed out, making them bow-legged. A team of paleoanthropologists led by Mary Leakey confirmed the bipedality of A. afarensis with another find in Tanzania, the Liatoli footprints. In 1976, Andrew Hill and another team member discovered fossilized footprints. The footprints turned out to be an 80-foot trail made by 2 hominins who had clearly been walking on 2 feet. The Liatoli footprints are virtually identical to those made by modern humans walking on soft ground, and the feet were almost certainly from Lucy's kin. The tracks are the right size, and the trail dates from around 3.6 million years ago. The first soil-using human was Homo habilis, whose remains appear about 2.5 million years ago. Homo habilis means handyman, and his fossils are associated with a variety of flakestone tools used for chopping, scraping, and butchering. Habilis does show changes towards a more human-like condition, including reduced back teeth and a brain larger than those of Australopithecus. A cast of one brain shows distinct swellings corresponding to Broca's area and Wernicke's area, parts of the brain's left lobes associated with speech production and comprehension. These raise the possibility that Homo habilis was the first species with spoken language. Homo erectus, meaning upright man, holds the distinction of being the first hominin to leave Africa. Its remains have been found in China, Indonesia, Europe, and the Middle East. The brain size of Homo erectus was nearly equal to that of modern humans. Their skeletons were also nearly identical to ours, though they still had a flattened chinless face, the chin being a hallmark of Homo sapiens. They used complex tools such as stone axes and scrapers with intricate flaking. The species was also responsible for one of the most monumentous events in human cultural history, the control of fire. Homo erectus left 2 descendants, Homo heidelbergensis and Homo neanderthalensis. Homo heidelbergensis first appears 500,000 years ago, showing a mixture of modern human and Homo erectus features. Neanderthals show up a bit later, around 230 years ago, and lived all over Europe and the Middle East. They had large brains, even bigger than those of modern humans, and were excellent tool makers, as well as adept hunters. Some skeletons were accompanied by grave goods, such as animal bones and tools. This suggests that Neanderthals ceremonially buried their dead, perhaps the first inkling of human religion. Homo sapiens forced out every other hominin on Earth. There are 2 theories to how this was done. The first, multi-regional theory, proposes evolutionary replacement. Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalensis simply evolved into Homo sapiens independently in several areas, because natural selection was acting the same way all over Asia, Europe, and Africa. The second, out of Africa theory, proposes that modern Homo sapiens originated in Africa and spread, physically replacing Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalensis by outcompeting them or killing them. Genetic and fossil evidence supports the out of Africa theory, probably because it boils down to the significance of race. The longer human populations have been separated, the more genetic differences they will have accumulated. The multi-regional hypothesis, with its splitting of populations over 1 million years ago, would predict 15 times more genetic differences between races than if our human ancestors left Africa only 60,000 years ago. In 2003, discovered on the island of Flores in Indonesia, individuals of Homo floresiensis were named hobbits, for their adult height was only 1 meter and they weighed only 50 pounds. Their brains were also proportionally small, about the size of Australopithecus, and their teeth and skeletons were indisputably those of Homo. They used stone tools and may have preyed on Komodo dragons and dwarf elephants. The best guess is that floresiensis represents an isolated population of Homo erectus that colonized Flores and was somehow bypassed by the spread of modern Homo sapiens, although floresiensis was probably an evolutionary dead end.
Studies on the genetic difference between humans and chimps have concluded that protein sequences differ on average by 1.5%. However, given that proteins are typically composed of several hundred amino acids, a 1.5% difference translates to several differences in protein sequence. When you alter 1.5% of amino acids, you alter far more proteins. To quote the book, a single difference can have substantial effects. Modern sequencing allows us to see that more than 80% of all proteins shared between the two species differ by at least one amino acid. Human beings have approximately 25,000 genes that code for protein production, so that 80% translates to differences in 20,000 of them. We also differ in whether or not genes are present at all, as 6% of our genes aren't even found in chimpanzees. Differences also exist in the number of copies of genes. For instance, humans have many copies of the gene that codes for salivary amylase, which helps the saliva break down carbohydrates upon ingestion. Chimps only have one. These genomic differences lead to associated differences in anatomy and physiology. We sweat more than any other ape. We also think and behave differently, attributable to differences in size and brain structure. What about differences among human beings? What about different races? The field of biology was long used as a refuge for theories founded on racial prejudice, but differences in our perceptions of race do not necessarily indicate a difference on the basis of genetics. It does indicate that human populations formed separate groups for long enough spans of time that different races were formed, but only 10 to 15% of genetic variation in humans is represented by differences between races. The remaining 85 to 90% of genetic variation is represented by differences between individuals within races. This should not be taken to mean that racial differences can be ignored, because different areas involve different evolutionary pressures. Sickle cell anemia is common in blacks of African descent because it helps alleviate the systemic effects of malaria. Selection for traits governing cold acclimatization have led to certain Inuit populations to have increased circulation to their digits, enabling them to maintain higher temperatures in their extremities. And darker skin in populations living in tropical areas affords them protection from UV damage, leading to skin cancers. Still, other differences are thought to be the result of sexual selection. Human beings are unique in our capacity for communication and our development of complex cultures. These cultures assign value to certain individuals with certain traits. In turn, these traits are sexually selected for and propagate within the population. This propagation is incredibly fast, lending itself to the rapid differentiation among human beings, which has led to what we define as independent races. But differences in intellect and modes of behavior are far too complex to have evolved in such a short amount of time. Any differences in this respect should simply be attributable to differences in culture. While there aren't any major differences between races, there are some rather significant differences between ethnic groups. For example, lactose intolerance is common among Asian and African populations, and uncommon in certain populations of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The frequency of the tolerant allele correlates to a population's consumption of milk, whether from cows or camels. Archaeological evidence supports this hypothesis, concluding that lactose tolerance through adulthood unilaterally coincides with a rise in pastoralism. These genes were easily propagated because individuals who possessed a tolerant allele had a selective advantage over those who didn't. Recent examples of selection beg the question, are we still evolving? And there may not be a good answer. It is somewhat certain that bad genes like those coding for bad eyes or bad teeth would have been selected against in the evolutionary arenas of the past. However, medical advancement has allowed for certain traits to survive that wouldn't have otherwise been evolutionarily cold. In a certain sense, this means that we are devolving. But as long as there is sexual reproduction paired with sources of mortality like disease, there will be an opportunity for selection.
The great debate, evolution versus intelligent design. Many people believe the evidence for evolution is convincing, yet still don't believe it's true. A common belief about evolution is that if we recognize that we are simply just evolved mammals, then what stops civilization from being completely unlawful? Another misinterpretation of evolution derives from Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. With limited background knowledge, the title may seem to imply that human behavior thrives off of acting selfishly and only caring about oneself, when the true premise of the book is a metaphor for how natural selection works. Genes act like selfish molecules. Those that produce better adaptations act as if they're elbowing out other genes in the battle for the future existence. Selfish genes can produce selfish behaviors, yet also there's a huge component on how evolution can favor genes that lead to cooperation, altruism, and even morality. The selfish gene could have easily been called the cooperative gene. Are we hardwired to be selfish, cooperative, or both? In recent years, evolutionary psychology has risen to interpret human behavior in light of evolution. Evolutionary psychology seeks to explain modern human behaviors as adaptive results of natural selection acting on the part of our ancestors. But when starting from the beginning of human civilization to present date, about 6,000 years, the timeline merely reflects a fraction of the total time that the human lineage has been isolated from that of chimpanzees. Selection would have taken many eons for humans to adapt to such an alternative lifestyle. Evolutionary psychologists call the physical and social environment to which we have adapted during the long period the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or EEA. Evolutionary psychologists believe humans retain many behaviors even if they are no longer adaptive today. All human societies seem to widely recognize human universals. Most of these behaviors distinguish humans from other animals. They can be seen as aspects of human nature. There's a very large category of behaviors sometimes seen as adaptations, but whose evolution we virtually know nothing about. This includes many of the most things we humans find interesting, like moral codes, religion, and music. There is no end of theories about how features have evolved. Some modern thinkers have constructed elaborate scenarios about how our sense of morality and moral tenets might be products of natural selection working on inherited mindset of a social primate, just as language enabled the building of complex society and culture. But in the end, these ideas come down to untested and probably untestable speculations. It's almost impossible to reconstruct how these features evolved and whether they are direct adaptations or merely byproducts of complex brain that developed evolutionary through behavioral flexibility to take care of its body. Certain parts of our behavior may be genetically encoded and instilled by natural selection in our past ancestors, but genes aren't our destiny. The world seems to be filled with selfishness, immorality, and injustice, yet the planet also shows many acts of kindness and altruism. There may be elements of both behaviors that come from our evolutionary heritage, but these acts are largely a matter of choice, not from our genes. Giving to charity, volunteering, and to eradicate disease in poor countries, fighting fires, are acts of kindness that have no evolutionary merit. In Roman times, some of the most sophisticated minds that ever existed find it entertaining to sit down and watch humans literally fight for their lives against wild animals. Many behaviors in regards to being compassionate and caring have nothing to do with evolution. For change to be happening so fast, it cannot merely be caused by our genes. But evolution tells us where we came from, but not where we go. Although evolution operates in a purposeless, materialistic way, that doesn't mean that our lives have no purpose. Many scientists have found profound spiritual satisfaction in the wonders of the universe and our ability to make sense of them. Albert Einstein, often mistakenly described as conventionally religious, nevertheless saw the study of nature as a spiritual experience. Many European countries whose residents fully embrace evolution manage to remain fully civilized. Evolution is neither moral nor immoral. Human beings may only be one small twig on the vast branching of a tree of evolution. As natural selection has forged our brains, it has opened us up to a whole new world. We have learned how to improve our lives immeasurably over our ancestors, who were plagued with disease, discomfort, and a constant search for food. We are one creature to whom natural selection has brandished a brain complex enough to comprehend the laws that govern the universe.